Hello, welcome to the Omnivorous Bookworm. My name is Lauren, and today I wanted to talk about The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope. This is number 5 in the Barchester series. There's one more to go, and I will finish the Barchester series. So the way I'm going to do this review, I'm going to do it a little bit different than I've done the other reviews. I'm going to go into a short description of the sort of the setup of the book, talk about my impressions, how I felt about certain things, and then I'm going to go into some spoilers because in this book I feel like it's difficult to talk about all the things that I really liked about it without getting into some of the spoilery things. But I will not talk about any spoilers until, like, I will warn you and I'll go like this. So yeah, so the first part you're fine if you haven't read it. Plus, with Anthony Trollope, it's not really about the plot. Honestly, I read a description of the plot before I read the book, and I do that sometimes with Anthony Trollope books or with classics in general because I feel like it kind of helps me to understand where we're going, so I don't just feel like I'm floating along and like, what is going with it? Like, and I get less frustrated, I think, if things aren't moving at the speed that I'm used to in a modern book, if that makes sense. So personally, I don't mind spoilers, but I know other people do, so I respect that. So this book was published in 1864. Like I said, it's number 5 in the Barchester. All of these books, they're set in the same world, but they are all standalones. And I would say this one in particular is very much a standalone. I haven't read the Pallister series yet, but from what I read in my research of the book, research, that's a strong word, looking at the book, they called this like a hinge book between the two series. So we introduce the character of Pallister, but we still have some of the characters from older Barchester books, but they're pretty much minor characters, and it's always described who they are. If you've read the other Barchester books, it gives you a deeper understanding of the actual characters we're talking about. You understand who they are, but it's not necessary. Like, I really like this book. If you want to read just one in the series, well, I haven't read the last one, but I like this one more than Barchester Towers, which was my favorite up until this point. And I was really surprised by that because the setup is somewhat similar to Dr. Thorne, which I did not enjoy, so it was very interesting to me. So what we have here, we have two young adult women that live with their mother in the small house at Allington, which is the house that would be set up for like the dowager or like the mother-in-law suite that we would call it now, like within a house. But since this is a giant estate, they get their own little house, which I'm sure is still nice. And they live with their widowed mother in the small house. And then in the large house lives their uncle, Christopher, who they call the squire. He's Christopher Dale. And then the two girls are Lily and Belle Dale, and then their mother. So that's sort of the circle, and then you get all these people, all these intertwining stories. They don't all come together, but they're all connected to different characters around. So we have the Dale family, and then so Christopher is the main guy. He has also a nephew who brings his friend Crosby, and then he becomes intertwined in their life. We also go back to the Courcy Castle. We have all these different people. John Ames, he was like one of my favorite characters, or Eames, I don't know how you say that, Johnny. He is really funny. I really, really liked him. And he's living in Guestwick. So we have Allington is this place. We also go to Guestwick. We also go, I think, to Barchester a little bit. One of the characters does. And we see some of the characters that we've seen before. So that's sort of the setup. We deal with a lot of the themes as far as marriage, but Anthony Trollope really does it in a different way than you see in a lot of Victorian novels, and you can start to see him kind of coming into his own, starting to take chances about what he's writing about. He's definitely, we have a lot of older characters who were either never married, or if they were married, their spouse has died and they have no children, so they're single. And he's showing over and over again that it's much better to be single than to be in a bad marriage. Of course, he thinks that the best is to be in a happy marriage, but if you but you don't want to rush that. You don't want to get married too young. Anthony Trollope is very uh, critical of younger people who are immature, and he makes a big point about it's not about age, it's about maturity level, and whether it doesn't make them a bad person, but it's not somebody that you want to marry if they are not ready yet. And that's a very interesting point that he really gets into and looks at marriage in that way. One of the interesting things that I really enjoy about Anthony Trollope's books, and I usually look it up. So they mention that the widowed mother and the two adult daughters are living in the small house of Allington, and they are not wealthy. They are considered that they have class, but they are not of the upper echelon, and especially being in the country, there's less competition for class. So they mention that the mother gets £300 a year from her, I guess, her dead husband's estate. So I looked up to see how much would that be in today's money. So £300 in today's British pounds would be 33,474 British pounds today. And that also, because I live in Mexico, but I'm from the U.S., so I wanted to find out what it was in U.S. dollars, was 46,857, so about 50,000 a year. So it's interesting because a lot of these people are talking about how poor they are, but also you have to keep in mind she's living in this house for free. So she has zero housing expenses. So all they're paying for is clothing, food, also household help, things of that nature. But it gives you an interesting idea of what kind of circle they're in, that's considered not a lot of money. Obviously, you can't just look at inflation to look at money. Now everything is, manufactured by machines. We have a lot of things that are a lot cheaper. We don't have to worry about paying for horses. We don't have to pay for, coal, things of that nature that would probably be more expensive. But for me personally, it helps me to get an idea of what are we actually talking about if somebody's considered not that wealthy. So I enjoyed all of that. I really enjoyed how Anthony Trollope looks at the main characters. One thing I noticed, and it has taken me this long to notice, is what Anthony Trollope does. When he describes his characters, he will always start off describing the negative parts of them, whether it's physical or their character. He will always describe their negative parts first, and then he'll describe some of their positive points, or he'll sort of put a spin on it as in a loving way, like, well, it's not that bad. So even the main characters, he will put, well, her lips weren't as, thick as they could have been to be beautiful. I mean, obviously he doesn't write like that. He's much better than me, but that's what he'll do. And I really like that. And I think it makes you love his characters more, because if the character just seems perfect and great or just horrible, you can't relate to them as much. But he really makes them feel very human. I would say, especially in this book, he does such a great job of understanding human psychology, and he'll describe what they're doing, but then he'll also describe what they're thinking about at the same time. And it just made for me the characters, but also as well people at this time, because he talks about, well, when people do this or when this is happening. And it was one of those books where you really related to Victorian people as just people, and realized that, yeah, they might have come from a different time and culture than how we live today, but they had the same worries and they had the same concerns a lot of times, and they weren't as different. They weren't this alien species that I think we like to think about with people in the past. And he also talks about marriage, and he will talk about, in one scene, he talks about that this man didn't choose the right woman, and he will say that the woman that he chose can't really hold on a conversation about politics or history, and he talks about how that's important. It's really important that you have a wife that has a life of the mind. I mean, she doesn't word it that way, but can can be your intellectual equal. And then, but then he will say, for some men, like that's not necessary. They could just have basically like a airhead. But then he doesn't say it that way, obviously. But then he will kind of imply that the man is also. So it's like, well, if the man is an airhead, then his wife can be superficial. That's okay. But if the man is thoughtful, then 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 his wife needs to be thoughtful. And I just thought that was so interesting and so lovely, and you just get a sense of what he thinks a marriage should be. And from all accounts that I read, because I started to research, did Anthony Trollope have a loving marriage? And it seems that he did, and I'm not surprised by that, because he doesn't idealize marriage, but he talks about what a good marriage looks like, and it seems that he did have a good marriage, and what you should want in your marriage. And if you can't have that, then yeah, just be single, because being in a bad marriage is just hell, especially at this time, because there was really no way out. Um, and then I learned a new word, which is hobbledehoy, and Anthony Trollope also uses hobbledehood, which I had never heard. And it's basically describing, he uses it a lot with one particular character who's a man, but he also uses it for a female character. It's somebody, and he makes a point, it doesn't matter how old they are, but it's somebody who physically and mentally and emotionally is just in that sort of gangly in between phase, and isn't quite a man yet, or isn't quite a woman yet, but they want to be. And so he talks about them being a hobbledehoy, and I just thought that was the funniest word. I really liked it. Like, why don't we use that word more? I like it. And the hobbledehood, he's like in the middle of their hobbledehood. That's so great. So he talks about that as well. All right, so now I'm going to get into some spoilers. So if you don't want to hear spoilers, don't watch the rest of this. But like I said, it's Anthony Trollope. It's not very plot based. So we have Lily Dale, and she ends up getting engaged with Crosby, and then he breaks off the engagement and goes with this other woman, and they're married 10 weeks, and then he decides that he's done. He's like, well, she decides she wants to go back with her mother. Like, this was a mistake, and he ends up with less money, but he's happy because he just sees into what his future is going to be with his wife, and he's just like, no, I'm going to stay at my club, I'm going to use my money for myself. And the character never seems to recognize that he should have um you know not done that. Like, he should have just stayed single, or he should have married Lily, but he doesn't. Like, at least not a lot to the reader. It's more that he's just like, phew, she's gone. And Anthony Trollope even acknowledges, like, at least they didn't have a baby together. That's good. And they also talk about that there were people, like, this character knew a lot of people who were married, and they just went their separate ways. So I think it also gives us an interesting window that even though divorce, like official divorce, might not have been socially acceptable, at least people of a certain class, because you're going to have enough money to have two living places, right? But people of a certain class would just kind of go their separate ways. They just would, you live here, I live here. Yeah, we're married, but not really. So he talks a lot about that. And like I said, we have a lot of characters who are older and not married. We also have a lot of characters, I probably should talk about this earlier, but who on the surface, if you just see what they're doing, they seem kind of like a jerk or not very nice. But we get into their head and we realize that they mean well. And but if you met them, like, you like them in the book, but if you met them in real life, you probably wouldn't like them. Like Lady Julia and Christopher Dale in particular are two people that you just get sort of a soft place for in your heart, and you realize that they're good, kind people, and they're both single. And he doesn't say this, but you kind of get the impression that based on their personality, they would probably have a really hard time being married. And I think Anthony Trollope is alluding to the fact that not everybody needs to be married. We don't need to be pushing people into marriage. And at the end, we have Lily Dale. Lily Dale is our main character. She never gets married. Johnny Eames likes her. He wants to marry her. But because she's smart, and she's like, I don't love him. I don't love him like that. I loved Crosby. He made the mistake. He went the wrong way. He ended up in a bad marriage. I'm not going to make that mistake. She doesn't say it that way, but as a reader, we get that impression. So Lily is smart enough to say, no, I'm not. If I'm not going to marry somebody that I love, then I choose not to be married. And at the end, she's very happy and she's single. And we don't know if she remains single because she's still pretty young. But I think it was really interesting and really good that Anthony Trollope did that. And she's getting to an age where I think in society at this time, there would be a concern like, oh, you're going to be a spinster or you're going to be an old maid, whatever. And she doesn't care. It's not something to be worried about. It's just, well, if the right person comes along, that's great. If not, being single is not the end of the world. And she has her own money. She gets her own money before her uncle dies. And it's just a very empowering book. And I'm honestly surprised that a man wrote it. It makes me very interested in Anthony Trollope. I know that he was raised without a lot of money, but with education. So I think it gave him an interesting window into people and how they think. And I in the last book I read, which was Framley Parsonage, he even talks about, when the Americans committed genocide against the Native Americans. I mean, I don't know that he uses those words, but um, he calls it a genocide, and I just think, wow, for somebody in the 1860s to be recognizing that these things are happening and they're not good. It just is a reminder that just because things were happening around these people, it doesn't mean that everybody was just agreeing with it and thinking, oh yeah, that's great that we're conquering these places and that people are being mistreated or that women are looked down on. He definitely never treats women as being intellectually inferior. I mean, he does have a view of them as sort of the fairer sex and sort of the mores or the rules of society at that time of how you should treat women, but it's never, from the books that I've read, it's never in a derogatory way. It's never, so he's a man of his time in that way, but he never seems to, like I said in the earlier, he talks about that you need to find a woman you can discuss politics with and history and who has a good life of the mind, and you're just like, oh, okay, that's great. So it gives you an idea of how he views women. And also Christopher Dale, how he views his nieces. At first he's just going to give money to his nephew and then his one niece, and then he's like, no, I'm going to give money to all the nieces, even the younger ones, so it doesn't matter if they're older or younger. Christopher Dale keeps wanting Belle to marry her cousin, and Belle doesn't want to marry her cousin. She marries a doctor. So again, showing that she doesn't give in to family pressure. She marries the person who is right for her, not right for her family. And it is always creepy to me when they talk about marrying their cousins in Victorian. I was like, no, don't marry your cousins, gross. But I know it's normal at that time. But we talk about that, and Anthony Trollope also does a really interesting thing with money and marriage. So he'll talk about that it's bad to marry for money. Like, don't choose the person for their money, but it is definitely something you need to consider. Like, you will definitely get that in Anthony Trollope. Like, and I think that comes from him growing up poor. Is like, let's not idealize poverty here. Like, he's very much into like making fun of anybody who will idealize poverty. And he's like, well, you need to find a way to live. And I don't know, it just reminds me so much of my grandpa. He's passed, but my grandpa was very much like that. He's like, how are you going to live? If somebody was going to get married, he was always concerned. But he would never tell somebody to marry for money. So I don't know. I really like that about the Anthony Trollope's characters. But and Johnny Eames, there's a scene where he punches Crosby in the face for jilting Lily, because Lily has been left at the altar, or not left at the altar. Her engagement was ended. And it also shows you how you get a lot of the anxiety of the women, the mothers especially, that as soon as their daughter's engaged, they need them to get married fast, because if there's any mark on their reputation, or if the man waits too long and he changes his mind, they know it's going to be very difficult for their daughter to find a future spouse. And we get that with Anthony Trollope. He does it in a lot of different cases where we see this anxiety. And so when Lily's left, everybody in her family is very angry about it. And the interesting thing with Anthony Trollope is he could have made Crosby the villain. And he doesn't really. I mean, he will say, I mean, you definitely don't like Crosby. You definitely feel like he did a bad thing. But we get that he did it out of immaturity, and we start to see him like when he's with these people he does this, when he's with these people, and then when Lily's uncle shows up and he's like sneaking out the back door, like literally trying to get away, and he's just, like, this guy has no business being married. He's just completely immature. So it's really funny. I laughed out loud several times reading this book. I really enjoyed all the parts. And then when Johnny Eames punches Crosby in the face, you're just like cheering for him. And even Lady Julia, she's very much kind of she's not married either, and she's sort of this dour woman, or portrayed that way. But you can see she's really good, and she really likes certain people. And she's really happy. She's really happy that Johnny Eames punches them. The other thing that Anthony Trollope goes into a lot, because when we talk about getting married and having children, especially at this time, the main anxiety was, I need to find an heir. I need to find an heir. And so we have all these people who don't have children, are not married. There's even the Duke of Omni. We have the Lord of Guestwick, Christopher Dale, Julia, but Lady Julia, she doesn't have money because she's a woman, and I think that's all. But they don't have any children, but they find their heirs. They either do it through a niece or a nephew, or with the Lord Guestwick, he does it through somebody that he meets. And it's interesting because Anthony Trollope is saying, why, in a way, why are you concerned about this? If you want to find an heir, there's plenty of people you can find. An heir will probably be better than your child, who you don't know how your child's going to turn out. And I just think that's a very interesting thing for him to do, especially at this time. We also get into, and I think this is age old, and it's what we relate to the most, is that one of the worst crimes you can commit in society is infidelity, or doing something against somebody in a relationship sense. And so we get that with Johnny Eames punching, but it's definitely not something that we want the courts to legislate. So it's this sort of weird thing where if you tell somebody, it's like, oh, that's the worst thing, but you would never say, like, we'll put them in jail, or that should be against the law, because we don't want the government like this getting into people's love lives at all. So and he talks about that when Johnny Eames punches him, and it's sort of like, well, there's the law. Yeah, he shouldn't punch him, but then there's this law over the law, and what is decent and what we should be doing. And sometimes those things are different. The other interesting thing is they talk about, well, 30 years ago, I would have, challenged him to a duel, or I don't know if he used those words, but he explains it that way. And it's interesting because that's around the time, because this book was published in 1864. So that would have been around the time when Jane Austen was writing. I'm like, that's interesting. I don't know if they would have done that, but oh well. Maybe in the country they would have. All right, so that is The Small House at Allington. It's definitely my favorite. I really loved it. And if you want to read one book by Anthony Trollope, it's a long one, but it's really good. It's a great study of human nature and psychology and the time, and it doesn't have a lot of the politics that Anthony Trollope does really well, but it does have a lot of the inner workings of the mind, and having it be a very realistic book, but still interesting. So, that's my review. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.